Welcome to Don't Know Much About with me, Dr. Naya Lekht. I'm a teacher, I'm a writer, and I'm a speaker. My motto is, it all starts with a question. Don't Know Much About is a show devoted to some of the most talked about issues that are often, very much misunderstood. I want to use this space and time to take all the questions that I've gotten around one really spicy topic, and that is the Arab-Israeli conflict, known better as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict today. Now, I'm completely aware that today information is just a click away. But I want to use my time with you all here to dive into some complex issues in order to clarify things, to make the complex accessible. I'll conclude by choosing a question from the many questions I received leading up to each episode. So the first one that we are going to deal with on Don't Know Much About is the Nakba. What is the Nakba? Well, in Arabic, Nakba means catastrophe or disaster. Now, if you go on Google, you're likely to encounter the following description. The Nakba is the Palestinian experience of dispossession and loss of their homeland. Elsewhere, you will encounter this. The Zionist forces expelled local Palestinians to ensure a decisive Jewish majority in the future state of Israel. Nakba, they say, is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people from their homeland. Wow, much to unpack here. But I love to begin by taking a look at the word itself, the word Nakba. So let's examine when it was first used, how it was used, and how the term Nakba evolved into meaning something, very different today. Now, the first use of the word Nakba in relation to Israel had a very different meaning. In a pamphlet published in 1949, The Meaning of the Disaster, Syrian intellect Constantine Zureiq wrote, quote, "We, the Arabs, must admit our mistakes and recognize the extent of our responsibility for the Nakba, the disaster that is our lot." Remarkably, what Zureiq is saying here is that the catastrophe, this disaster, is not that Israel or the Zionists drove any local Arabs out, but rather self-inflicted by Arab leaders, that Arabs did not take responsibility for the disaster that they themselves created. Now, to be fair, Zureiq was not a fan of Zionists. Elsewhere, he wrote rather vehemently about the Zionist project and imperialism. But what does he mean here? What responsibility is he talking about? Now, to answer this question, we have to understand a few things. First, the growing tensions between the Arabs and the Jews in the British Mandate for Palestine, and the role played by the British and the United Nations in trying to settle these tensions. Now, viewing the hostilities between the Jews and the Arabs as having to do with land, these mediators, first the League of Nations and later the United Nations, did what most would do, offer several divisions of the land. And from 1920 to 1948, there were about 3 proposals to divide the land. Each proposal was accepted by Jews, however reluctantly, and decisively rejected by the Arabs. Now, the last of these 3 proposals to divide the mandate is known as the 1947 UN Partition Plan. Even though the Jewish people were promised the entire mandate for Palestine for a reconstitution of a national homeland by the League of Nations back in 1920, the Jews accepted this proposal. The Arabs rejected. And here is where the story begins. Now, at this time, the leader of the Jewish people in the Yishuv was a man by the name of David Ben-Gurion. And he made the decision to declare the state of Israel on May 14th, 1948. May 19, 1948 is the July 4th of Israel, known in Hebrew as Yom HaAtzmaut. The Arabs declared they would go to war to prevent the creation of this Jewish state. Jamal Husseini, the Arab Higher Committee's spokesman, told the UN before the partition vote that the Arabs would, quote, "drench the soil of our beloved country with the last drop of our blood," end quote. The first large-scale assaults began before May 14th, on actually January 9th, 1948, when approximately 1,000 Arabs attacked the Jewish community in the northern region of Palestine. And on May 15th, 1948, just one day after the declared statehood, 5 Arab countries attacked the fledgling Jewish state. By the way, in addition to the 5 Arab armies, there was another army known as the Arab Liberation Army, which joined. Now, just as much as I like to look at language, pictures reveal quite a bit. Take a quick look at the logo of this 6th Army, the Arab Liberation Army that joined the war against Israel. I don't know about you, but this signals, well, quite strongly a vision to annihilate the Jews. And so, on May 14th, 1948, the first of many Arab-Israeli wars began. Wars are messy. This is not a moral equivocation. When you are fighting a defensive war for survival, you fight. And if you are waging an offensive war, your resolve pushes you forward. This is not particular to the conflict between Israel and her Arab neighbors. This is true of conflicts around the world. But what about if you have nothing to do with the war? What if you're just a local peasant, a farmer who wants to live your life peacefully? Well, many of the Arabs who lived in the British Mandate for Palestine, they didn't have much of a say. Caught in the war between the Jews fighting in a defensive battle and 6 Arab armies waging an offensive war, these Arabs fled their homes. They did so mostly to avoid being caught in the crosshairs of battles. They didn't want to die. And here is where Constantine Zureiq returns. Remember, he writes that, quote, "We the Arabs must admit our mistake and recognize the extent of our responsibility for the Nakba, for the disaster that is our lot." But wait a second, what mistake is he speaking of here? Few people tell this story, but the majority of Arabs who fled their homes were told to do so by Arab leaders. Primarily, however, 2 factors contributed to local Arabs choosing to leave their homes. First, thousands of wealthy Arabs left, and they didn't want to be caught in the violence. Second, thousands more responded to Arab leaders who told the Arabs to get out of the way of the advancing armies. These orders largely came from the Arab National Committee. Let's take a look at one such order from March 8th, 1948, months before the official war began. Quote, "Any opposition to this order, that is the order of leaving your house, is an obstacle to holy war and will hamper the operations of the fighters in these districts." But why would the Arab leadership do this? Why would they urge the local population to leave their homes? Well, the answer lies in the simple fact that Israel was a very new country, with an army largely consisting of refugees, of Holocaust survivors. In terms of numbers, Israel was outnumbered. In terms of access to weapons, Israel was likewise in the weaker position. So when the Arab leaders urged the local population to leave, they were operating from a place that saw victory to be swift. Indeed, they were so confident, they promised the Arabs that they would be able to return to their homes once they destroyed the Zionist entity. In his memoirs, Khaled al-Azm, the Syrian prime minister, wrote this in 1948-49. He basically admitted the Arab role in persuading these local Arabs to leave. He wrote, "Since 1948, we have been demanding the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encouraged them to leave. Only a few months separated our call to leave and our appeal to the United Nations to resolve on their return." And what about Jewish leaders? How did they relate to the local Arab population on the eve of the war? In numerous instances, Jewish leaders urged the Arabs to remain in Palestine and join them in becoming citizens of Israel. On October 2nd, 1947, the Assembly of Palestine Jewry issued this appeal, quote, "We will do everything in our power to maintain peace and establish a cooperation gainful to both the Jews and the Arabs." Jewish leadership were very well aware that reestablishing the Jewish state, the country, that they would inherit a significant Arab population. In fact, I'd like to tell a story that's rarely told, and it involves David Ben-Gurion and his cabinet of men and women who deliberated for days. What will they call Israel? Well, apparently some wanted to name the Jewish country Judea, a reference to the Judean kingdom, the last Jewish sovereign presence in the land of Israel before the Jewish people were expelled by the Romans in 70 AD. Ben-Gurion vehemently opposed this name. Why? What were his reasons? Knowing that Israel would gain a significant Arab, non-Jewish population, calling the country Judea would mean that the citizens would be called Judeans, which in Hebrew is Yehudim. It means Jews. But not all the Jews citizens would be Jewish. So, in an effort to be more inclusive, Ben-Gurion and others chose the name Israel. Now, I share this story because it's just such a vivid example of Jews not having this intention of kicking any groups out. They had wanted to live with the Arabs in peace. Now, take a look at this excerpt from Israel's Proclamation of Independence issued on May 14, 1948. It's written as follows. In the midst of cruel aggression, we call upon the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve the way of peace and play their part in the development of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its bodies and institutions. We extend our hand in peace and neighborliness to all the neighboring states and their peoples and invite them to cooperate with the independent Jewish nation for the common good of all. Thus far, we have examined the role that Arab leadership played in displacing their own people. But what else might Constantine Zureiq mean when he wrote that the Arabs must admit our mistake and take responsibility for the Nakba, the disaster? Well, simple. Had the Arabs agreed to the 1947 UN Partition Plan and not rejected it, they would have had their own state. Now, granted, it would have been the fifth newly formed Arab state. Let me repeat. Had the Arab leaders agreed to the UN Partition Plan, there would not have been a Nakba. Which brings us to the end of the war. In fact, by looking at the new political borders of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, we can really come to understand better the motivations for starting a war. On March 10, 1949, the first Arab-Israeli war ended. Israel emerged victorious as the Jewish people were able to push back the invading Arab armies. Let's take a quick look at these new borders of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. Gaza was taken over by Egypt, and Judea-Samaria came under Jordanian rule. The annexation of Gaza and Judea-Samaria by Egypt and Jordan was actually illegal. And that's key here, because for 18 years that they controlled this land, Egypt and Jordan ruled over these territories from 1949 to 1967. There were no calls to free Palestine. Neither Egypt nor Jordan were tasked to liberate these lands and create a Palestine. What did they do with this newly acquired land? Well, Egypt took over Gaza, but never gave the Arabs living there in Gaza Egyptian citizenship, thus keeping them as refugees. What about Jordan? Well, actually, Jordan ethnically cleansed Judea-Samaria from all Jews. Destroying Jewish landmarks in and around Jerusalem, Jordan took over this land and called it the West Bank, as from their vantage point, the land was west of the Jordan River. The Jordanians did not liberate the area and give the local Arabs their own Palestinian state. And what about the Arabs who remained in their homes during the war? What happened to them? Actually, 20% of Israel's population today is Arab. Many of these Israeli Arabs are descendants of Arabs who chose to stay. They are equal citizens who participate in the vibrant Jewish state. Some are judges, others are Knesset members, leaders, journalists, doctors, and teachers. Their presence in Israel is testimony to the fact that Israel did not have these intentions of displacing Arabs from Israel. Well, students often tell me, Dr. Lekht, you think Israel is perfect, that Israel can do no wrong. I've thought about this often. To this I say, Israel is doing the best it can under the circumstances presented to her. In the 1948 war, Arab villages, they were destroyed, as Arab villages often found themselves at the center of combat zones. I'll tell you of one such village, Deir Yassin. During the war, Arabs controlled several strategic vantage points which overlooked highways that enabled them to fire on convoys. One such vantage point was the village of Deir Yassin. It was located on a highway linking Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It was the only supply road. The Arabs had completely encircled Jerusalem, cutting off any ability for Jews to send artillery to Jews who were fighting in Jerusalem. The population of Deir Yassin was roughly around 750. The Jewish self-defense military group, known as the Irgun, launched an attack on Deir Yassin. Now, according to Menachem Begin, the leader of the Irgun, launching an attack on Deir Yassin actually began when a truck came in broadcasting through a loudspeaker a warning to civilians to evacuate the area, which many did. However, approximately 107 innocent Arab civilians were killed in Deir Yassin. The battle was difficult to fight because the Irgun did not know who were the civilians, who are the combatants. And in revisionist history, many historians claim that Deir Yassin is a prime example of a massacre, that the Jews came into this village and brutally massacred the civilian population. But another story unfolds. Local reports, the New York Times coverage of the event, and eyewitness accounts tell a different story. Did innocent people die as a result of the war? Yes, they did. Did civilians have to flee their homes? Yes, they did. But did Israel intentionally do this? Did the leaders of the Jewish state want to go to war? These questions are critically vital as they force us to deal with morality and truth. Moreover, and I want to stress this again, none of this would have happened had the Arab League accepted the 1947 Partition Plan. The Nakba narrative depicts the founding of Israel as a catastrophe that resulted in the dispossession of lands of these native people. Yasser Arafat, then the president of the Palestinian Authority, he created this Nakba Day on May 15, 1998, just as Israel was celebrating its 50th anniversary. The version, now promoted by Palestinian Arab leaders and their supporters, assigned exclusive blame for the 1948 catastrophe to the Jews, far from the original use of the word, if you remember. Soviet Jewish writer and journalist is said to have written, "Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I shall tell you what you are guilty of." The accusation of ethnic cleansing, of displacement, is exactly, actually, what the Arab countries were guilty of in 1948. 850,000 Jews who lived in Arab lands, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Yemen, were summarily expelled in 1948. The Jews of Judea Samaria who lived in Jerusalem and Hebron were likewise expelled. We used our time today to unpack the Nakba and, most importantly, to show that this narrative is being used as a propaganda tool to demonize, to delegitimize the only Jewish country, Israel. Alarmingly, in many K-12 schools in America, students are learning this Nakba narrative as a legitimate perspective. Well, this brings me to a question from Shayna L. from Florida. Shayna writes that while I understand that the Nakba may historically be incorrect, we cannot deny that many Palestinians today identify with it. It's part of their collective memory. How can we deny their right to create a past? Surely we have our stories of catastrophe too. Thank you for that question, Shayna. And you know what? It actually gets to the very heart of the issue. This then really is the tragedy of Palestinian national identity. See, the Nakba narrative is not doing the Palestinian people any service. In fact, it stifles their self-determination. Here's the thing, Israel's staying. It's not going anywhere. The moment the Palestinian leaders understand this, we will be in a better place. The moment the Palestinian leaders jettison a narrative that foments hatred, calls for the annihilation of an entire country, is the day we can begin to speak about peace. But I also want to take you up on your comparison with the Jewish people and their stories of catastrophe, because boy, oh boy, do we have many stories of catastrophe that have shaped our collective memory. Well, where should I begin? From being slaves in Egypt, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion of Jews from England in the 12th century, and for that matter, the many expulsions of Jews from different centers of Europe, being forced to live in ghettos in Italy in the 15th century, Khmelnytsky massacres of Eastern Europe, waves of pogroms under the Russian Empire, the Farhud pogrom in Iraq, to the Holocaust. I'm sure I'm missing many. We are not at a deficit of these catastrophic stories. But notice that in these moments of acute pain, I don't think that the Jewish people see themselves as victims. We do not create a narrative to demonize and delegitimize, say, the Russian Empire or even Germany today. Our pain is certainly there, and yet from each catastrophe, we emerge resilient. We are builders. Okay, you don't like us, England? We'll move elsewhere and thrive elsewhere. Okay, Russia, you don't want us? We'll find a different place. See, that's the story of Zionism. It's a story of resilience, of emerging with dignity from the many catastrophes. What a world we could live in if Israel's neighbors would use the story of Zionism as inspiration. Since 1947, remember that Partition Plan, there have been 4 proposals for what we would call today the two-state solution. Each has been rejected by Palestinian leaders. So you're right, Shayna. While the Nakba narrative may be built on lies, it is widely believed among many, many Palestinian Arabs. And this, then, is the tragedy. The tragedy of not coming to terms with the Jewish state in the Middle East. Is the world not ready for the defiant Jews, the sovereigns in the Middle East? What is clear, however, is that we are this Jew. What is clear, however, is we've totally become this Jew. Thank you for joining me on Don't Know Much About. To recap, the Nakba, number 1, was originally used to discuss a mistake committed by Arabs. Number 2, had the Arabs accepted the partition plan, there would most likely not be a Nakba. 3, the majority of Arabs who fled their homes did so because they were heeding the calls of the Arab leaders who told them to leave their homes. 4, those Arabs who chose to stay are equal partners in Israel today. 5, as it is used today, the Nakba narrative does not put the Palestinians on a trajectory of self-determination, nor does it give them dignity. Remember, it all begins with a question. Let's continue to ask those questions. Let's pursue truth. Stay tuned for future episodes. If you want me to cover a future topic and a future episode, drop a comment below or find me on social media. I'm Dr. Naya Lekht, and this is Don't Know Much About.